Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining all of us tonight for the commemoration of Kristallnacht and for Manhattan College, the 12th Frederick Schweitzer Lecture at Manhattan College. I am Dr. Mehnaz Afridi. I direct the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center. And I'm really pleased to see all of you and our honored guest, Dr. Peter Hayes. But the most exciting thing tonight is that this is a very special program because in the past 2 years, a group of scholars and Holocaust, human rights, and genocide directors have been getting together, and we've had 2 conferences. And this is our first regional partnership. So our goal is together in this consortium to offer support, best practices, networks, and resources and help scholars at risk. We are a consortium that prioritizes education for our future generations through the study of the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights, and pursue what we believe is the most integral form of education, which is the liberal arts, without which we would lose the richness and complexity of the human being. We hope that our work in history, religious studies, literature, and other disciplines will help our students and the public recognize prejudice and what it is, and to pursue the eradication of racism in our midst today. I'm pleased to note that the Consortium of Higher Education Directors of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights will also be holding its 3rd meeting at Manhattan College in the summer of 2022. Tonight, we have created an important regional partnership with the Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College, directed by Laura Cohen, and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the United States Military Academy at West Point, directed by Dr. David Fry, who will be giving some opening remarks and introducing the Jewish Chapel Choir. So Laura, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our virtual event commemoration for the 86th anniversary of Kristallnacht. I am Dr. Laura Cohen, Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College. And as Dr. Afridi said, we have a very meaningful program for you tonight. First, Dr. Fry will introduce the West Point Jewish Chapel Choir, and Dr. Afridi will then introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Peter Hayes. Afterwards, we'll have some time for a bit of Q&A, so please use the Q&A feature on your screen. The chat has been disabled for security reasons. Now, just for a bit of context. On November 9th and 10th, 1938, an anti-Jewish pogrom took place across Germany, Austria, and parts of former Czechoslovakia. It came to be known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Nazi Party officials, the SA, also known as stormtroopers and Hitler Youth, destroyed Jewish schools and establishments, burned synagogues, looted businesses, and desecrated cemeteries. Kristallnacht marked the first time that German Jews were imprisoned on a mass scale solely because of their ethnicity. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men were sent to local prisons and detention centers. From there, many were transferred to concentration camps, including those in Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald, where they endured brutal treatment and hundreds died. The destruction kicked off unprecedented anti-Semitic human rights violations and mass atrocities against Jewish people in Nazi-occupied Europe in the years that followed. 6 million lives exterminated, vanquished. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center was built to evoke this painful past by piecing together shards of glass. Yet it's also a space devoted to light, life, education, and remembrance. We do this by bringing students, faculty, community members, and survivors together to realize Harriet Kupferberg's vision, using the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Fry.
Of course, I've screwed up the mute button. So there, to break the ice for everyone. So thank you very much, Laura. I'm Dr. David Fry, and on behalf of West Point Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, I'm pleased to welcome all of you to tonight's talk and really wish to express my thanks to my colleagues, Dr. Mehnaz Afridi and Dr. Laura Cohen, for this wonderful collaboration. I too am very excited about what we will see this evening. So my role, as you heard, is to introduce West Point Center, which I direct, and also to introduce you to West Point's Jewish Chapel Choir. Now, first, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at West Point. The center's mission is to instill within current and future military leaders a sophisticated understanding of the Holocaust and other instances of genocide and mass atrocity, and inspire them to prevent future atrocities in their roles as military leaders. The center provides a critical space for research, teaching, and collaboration in interdisciplinary studies of the past and present. The center is internationally recognized as a hub of teaching, research, and practice for military education and training about mass atrocity and its prevention. Its unique work ensures that the U.S. Military Academy, the Army, the Defense Department, and the entire armed forces are permanently innovating, expanding the toolbox available for detection and prevention, and educating cohorts of future officers so that they are equipped with the knowledge and skills necessary to wrestle with humanity's worst conflicts. Now, one of the ways that the center goes about this is through public education. And tonight, as Dr. Afridi mentioned, we're embarking on a new multi-university cooperative education effort through commemoration of the November pogroms, which you just heard discussed, also known as Kristallnacht. So we're going to begin our program today with two songs courtesy of West Point's Jewish Chapel Choir, which was founded in 1947. While small and masked, the choir is powerful, as are the songs they will sing for us. The first song is Sag nit kein Mol, which is otherwise known as the Partisan Song. This song, inspired by news of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, was written by Hirsch Glick, an inmate of the Vilna Ghetto. Sung by Jewish partisan units, it is today sung to commemorate Jewish loss, Jewish resistance to Nazi oppression, and Jewish survival.
Never say that there is only death for you. The leaden skies may be concealing days of blue, because the hour we have hungered for is near. Beneath our tread the earth shall tremble, we are here. From land of palm trees to the far-off land of snow, we shall be coming with our torment and our woe, and everywhere our blood has sunk into the earth, shall our bravery and our vigor blossom forth. We'll have the morning sun to set our day aglow, and all our yesterday shall vanish with the flow. And if the time is long before the sun appears, then let the song go like a signal through the years. This song was written with our blood and not with lead. It's not a song that summer birds sing overhead. It was a people among dropping barricades, and sang the song of ours with pistols and grenades. But never say that there is only death for you. The leaden skies may be concealing days of blue, because the hour we have hungered for is near. Beneath our tread the earth shall tremble, we are here. Because the hour we have hungered for is near. Beneath our tread the earth shall tremble, we are here.
The second song you'll hear is Hatikva, which is quite well known. Hatikva was written by 19th century Hebrew poet Naftali Herz Imber, a Zionist from the area of what is today southern Poland. Its original form was as a 9-stanza ode of hope and freedom. The poem was set to music multiple times and in multiple forms. In the 1930s and 40s, Jews across Europe sang it in resistance to both the Nazi Holocaust and to Soviet terror. You'll hear a shortened version of Hatikva that is the current national anthem of Israel.
Thank you so much, David, and to the West Point Military Academy, and also to the wonderful choir. It's really a moment, a poignancy to think about diversity and how we can come across with each other, with different audiences and different people. I just want to introduce the Frederick Schweitzer Lecture and then Dr. Hayes, so I don't want to take up much time, but I would like to say a few things about Manhattan College and also the center. Manhattan College, a Lasallian Catholic college, has dedicated the last 24 years to the memory of the Holocaust through the work of the center, a Catholic college that has committed its resources and staff to create a deeper education for non-Jews. We are also the third college to have opened an exhibit last year, the Herman and Leah Ziering Archive Collections in memory of Holocaust survivors. And we are the first Catholic college or institution of any kind to hire a Muslim to head Holocaust Center. To say all that is a wonderful celebration. It's a wonderful celebration of diversity and acceptance of who we are with each other. However, all of this would not be possible without Dr. Frederick M. Schweitzer, who has been crucial to my last 9 years at Manhattan College. I've had the honor of talking about Dr. Frederick Schweitzer, who was the founder of the Holocaust Center back in 1996. He has been a great support and a pioneer in the field of Holocaust and anti-Semitism. As a historian, he fell into his area because he was asked to write about the challenges of Jewish-Christian relations. It was this that inspired him. His work always focused on the Holocaust. No other man has focused its attention exclusively on a thematic discussion of historical and contemporary anti-Semitic myths, covering such an expansive scope of time and allowing for such a painstaking level of exemplification. And Fred turned 90 this year. So Mazel Tov, happy birthday, and thank you, Fred. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce our distinguished speaker who has so kindly agreed to be our speaker this year virtually, even though he is now retired, but this is more fun, I would assume, Peter. But as you may or may not know, professors never retire. Dr. Hayes spoke at Manhattan College many years ago before I was hired, but I was also so taken by his work and his book, Why? Explaining the Holocaust, that I wanted to be selfish and have another go at it. Dr. Peter Hayes is a professor of history and German and Theodore Zeb Weiss Holocaust Educational Foundation, professor emeritus at Northwestern University, where he taught from 1980 to 2016. He specializes in the histories of Nazi Germany and Holocaust, and in particular, in the conduct of the nation's largest corporations during the Third Reich. Dr. Hayes is the author or editor of 13 books. I'm not going to list them, and multiple prize-winning teacher. He serves as chair of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum from 2014 to 2019. And I would just like to leave you with a quote of his. The Holocaust, he says, was the product of a particular time and place. Europe in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution and the upheavals of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. These were the contexts in which ancient hostilities toward Jews and Judaism, deeply rooted in religious rivalry, but updated with the trappings of modern science, turned into a fixation on removing Jews from civil society as a magical solution to all social problems. And without further ado, Dr. Peter Hayes. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this event. I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me to speak and to Professor Afridi for her kind introduction. Most students of the Holocaust regard the pogrom unleashed in Germany on the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, as a watershed moment. It's not that this was the first time, or even the first time in 1938, that Nazis had killed Jews or driven them to suicide, burned their synagogues, and marched thousands of Jewish men off to concentration camps. Austrian Jews already had experienced all of this in March 1938 during the Anschluss. The Reich had rounded up 5,000 German Jews and put them behind barbed wire during the summer of that year. And the synagogues of Munich and Nuremberg were set ablaze then too. What appeared different about the so-called Kristallnacht to people at the time were the scale and intensity of the destruction and violence. All these things happened all across the country to many more people at many more sites and with much greater ferocity than ever before. And what has stood out to historians since is something that the Nazi regime labored to conceal at the time: the organized, state-directed nature of the onslaught. In place of the arbitrary, episodic, uneven, and often locally instigated persecution and chicanery that beset German Jews during the preceding 5 years and 9 months of Nazi rule, a new phase of official and systematic degradation, humiliation, and dispossession seemed to have arrived. This prevalent understanding of what happened that November is simultaneously accurate and misleading. Accurate about the scale and barbarity of the assault. Misleading about the degree and forms of change in Nazi policy toward Jews that night. As to the scale, every dimension of the onslaught, the looting and the destruction of synagogues and residences and shops, the number of people made homeless, terrified, injured, and murdered, and the spectacle of somewhere between 26,000 and 30,000 Jewish men humiliatingly marched through the streets of the major cities on their way to deportation to camps. This vastly surpassed even the vicious rampage in Vienna several months earlier, let alone the occasional vicious assaults on Jews carried out by stormtroopers on Berlin's shopping boulevard, the Kurfürstendamm, in earlier years. Small wonder that within months, the number of applications for entry visas on file at foreign embassies and consulates in Berlin overtook the number of Jews left in Germany. Yet despite the terrifying shock of the November pogrom, it did not denote a change in Nazism's objective regarding Jews. The regime's leaders had defined this repeatedly and identically, both before Hitler came to power and in the first years thereafter. Jews and their influence had to be removed. The German word is entfernt, from the German sphere. Jews were stigmatized as Germany's incorrigible eternal enemies, sworn subversives and fifth columnists, whose traitorous actions had brought about the nation's defeat in World War I and would cause the same outcome of another conflict. The sole change over time was in the Nazi regime's choice of means to achieve removal. These evolved from inducing emigration to forcing expulsion to carrying out extermination. Kristallnacht signaled the completion of the first transition and heralded the coming of the second. To understand the transitional nature of what happened in Germany that night, we have to begin with a question that good historians raise with regard to any major event. Why now? Why did the Nazi regime unleash this pogrom in November 1938 and not earlier or later? The answer lies in the shifting relationship between the Third Reich's expansionist foreign policy and its exclusionist racial one. From 1933 to 1937, the Nazi regime's pursuit of these goals ran along parallel, mutually reinforcing lines as the new rulers of Germany felt their way forward, testing what they could get away with in reasserting their nation's international power and persecuting Jews at home. After all, Hitler started from an outwardly weak position. When he came to power in January 1933, His nation had no armed forces to speak of, and his party had not yet won a majority of Germany's voters or cabinet seats. In both foreign and racial policy, he therefore proceeded with similar caution at first, combining periodic but well-spaced attacks on the status quo with reassurances about the limited and justified nature of his intentions. He sought neither war nor murder, he told foreigners and Germans, only equality and self-determination for his country and reasonable in Jews' supposedly excessive influence over the people they lived among. Thus, 15 months separated Hitler's withdrawal from the European Disarmament Conference and the League of Nations in 1933 and his renunciation of the military restrictions of the Versailles Treaty in 1935. And another 15 months separated that move from his reoccupation of the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936. In so-called racial policy, 2 years or more stood between the beginning of the expulsion of the Jews from the German civil service and cultural life in 1933 and the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 that completed this process and also excluded Jews from the German military, deprived them of most citizenship rights, and forbade sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. Almost no conspicuous restrictions followed in 1936 and 37. All the while, outbreaks of overt violence against Jews were kept to a minimum and mostly out of sight or earshot of foreign reporters. Hitler supplemented this stop and go pattern in the public pursuit of his goals in the mid-1930s with a second covert approach. To conceal the pace of German rearmament, his regime created a dummy bond issuing corporation called MEFO that in effect doubled the size of the military expenditures that were publicly reported in the national budget. To inflict more harm on Jews than his sporadic national enactments could, he allowed local party bosses and stormtrooper units to harass and threaten individual Jews or their children, ensure their social isolation, and undermine their livelihoods. In short, the Third Reich pursued its intentions behind a smokescreen. In conjunction with wishful thinking on the part of some Germans and many British and French onlookers who dreaded the prospect of war, the result was widespread popular readiness to believe that Hitler's aspirations with regard to the international order and the presence of Jews in Germany could be kept within manageable bounds. This delusion underpinned the Anglo-French policy of appeasing Hitler's demands for territory, Britain's delay in rearming to face the danger of German aggression, and the general reluctance of foreign states to protest against Nazi violations of Jews' human rights or to provide adequate refuge to the victims of these violations. By late 1937, the Nazi regime's duplicity had enabled noteworthy successes. The Reich had created at least the appearance of an intimidating war machine, had begun a vast expansion of synthetic raw materials production to make Germany blockade-proof, had driven roughly 1/3 of the German Jewish population out of the country, had stripped German Jewry of almost 1/2 of its wealth. But Hitler concluded that he had merely set the stage for achieving his goals. Actually doing so meant that he now had to embark on a race against time. For one thing, he understood that the military edge he had acquired over Britain and France through breakneck spending on armaments was likely to prove fleeting once those nations brought the superior resources of their empires to bear. At a conference in Berlin on November 5th, 1937, Hitler therefore told his senior generals and ministers that Germany would have to fight its war for living space no later than in 1943 to 45, after which the Reich's window of opportunity would close. And he prophesied that conflict might have to come even sooner if opportunities arose to annex Austria and Czechoslovakia, which he considered quite possible. He did not refer at the meeting to a second respect in which he felt a sense of urgency, but his subsequent actions attest to it. If war was imminent, and if, as Hitler's ideology dictated, that war could not be won so long as Jews lived within German lines, the pace at which Jews were leaving the Reich had to accelerate. At the then current rates of mortality and emigration, no Jews would remain in Germany by the mid-1950s, but that was way beyond Hitler's time horizon for conflict. These were the considerations that led to the massive escalation of pressure on Jews in Germany from November 1937 to the Kristallnacht pogrom in November 1938. The Nazi regime now subjected Jews to an overt cascade of cruelty in order to persuade more of them to leave and to shock and awe other nations into opening their doors. Jewish businesses were defined as those in which one senior manager was a Jew, or 25% or more of the stock was owned by Jews. Swiftly deprived of government contracts, raw materials, and foreign currency with which to pay for imports, such firms had little choice but to fire any remaining Jewish executives and or to sell out at extortionist prices. Jewish communities lost their right to own property and had their synagogue and school sites confiscated. Jews had to complete an itemized census of their personal property, to add identifiably Jewish middle names, and to have their passports, if they held German ones, stamped with a red J. 30,000 Jews lost their jobs when the Reich forbade them to work as traveling salesmen. Thousands of Jewish doctors and lawyers saw their practices limited to serving other Jews. The government authorized municipalities to ban Jews from public streets on certain days of the week. It expelled Jews who held Soviet citizenship from the country early in 1938, and many of those who held Polish passports in October, thus setting off the chain of events that led to the Kristallnacht pogrom. But until that outburst of atrocity, the increasing pressure on German Jews led to only a small increase in the number who managed to get out of the country. The Evian Conference on Refugees in July 1938 revealed all but universal unwillingness on the part of the rest of the world to take in more Jews. Nations that had been receptive in the early 1930s, notably France, the Low Countries, and Czechoslovakia, had turned noticeably less so. In the United States, in the United States, immigration quotas continued to go unfilled as the public and the relevant divisions of the State Department balked at the admission of what were called, quote, refugees, unquote. While Britain continued to insist that it could serve only as a transit state, accepting only Jews destined for another ultimate destination, the dominions, notably Canada, South Africa, and Australia, declined to accept more than a handful of such people. Herschel Grynszpan's murder in Paris of the German diplomat Ernst vom Rath, in order to draw attention to the plight of his parents, who were among the Jews the Nazis had pushed into Poland, thus gave Hitler a pretext to ratchet up the pressure. He seized the chance because 1938 had handed him the annexation of Austria in March and the acquisition of the Czech borderlands via the Munich Conference at the end of September. These victories brought Hitler face to face with the inherent contradiction between his desires for the expansion of German territory and for the exclusion of Jews from it. Obtaining the former had worked against achieving the latter, since the newly acquired territories together contained 200,000 Jews, almost as many as had emigrated from the Third Reich since 1933. This newly recognized contradiction was what propelled not only the regime's decision to unleash the violence of early November 1938, but also the emergence in Nazi leadership circles of a new way of talking and thinking about policy toward the Jews. Given the prospect of not being able to get rid of Jews faster than the growing Reich added them, a prospect made vivid by the fact that the living space Hitler targeted lay in Poland and parts of the Soviet Union that were inhabited by millions of Jews. Given these facts, officials began to give voice to the previously inconceivable. The first documented use of a new vocabulary concerning the Reich's future treatment of the Jews comes from a report by a Swiss diplomat in Paris of his conversation on November 14th, 1938, less than a week after Kristallnacht, with the number 2 man in the German Foreign Ministry, Ernst von Weizsäcker, who had come to the French capital in order to attend a memorial service for Ernst vom Rath. Over lunch with the Swiss representative, Weizsäcker darkly declared, quote, "The National Socialist Party is so deeply engaged in conflict with Jewry that it cannot turn back, cannot even stand still. The remaining Jews in Germany should immediately be deported somewhere. If no country will take them in, they surely are going sooner or later toward their complete annihilation." 10 days later, Das Schwarze Korps, the publication of the Nazi SS, which now controlled the German police, editorialized as follows, quote, "The German people are not in the least inclined to tolerate in their country hundreds of thousands of impoverished Jews. In such a situation, we would be faced with the hard necessity of exterminating the Jewish underworld by fire and sword. The result would be the actual and final end of Jewry in Germany, its complete annihilation." Hitler needed only another 8 weeks to make the new vocabulary his. On January 21st, 1939, he told the Czech foreign minister that the Jews of Germany would be, quote, "annihilated," unquote, unless other nations admitted them. 9 days later, in a speech to the German Reichstag, this is actually an image of that speech, commemorating the 6th anniversary of his appointment as chancellor, Hitler predicted, quote, "the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe in the event of a new world war." As yet, all these remarks foretold annihilation, the German word is Vernichtung, only as something that would happen under certain conditions. But for the first time, the possibility was out in the open. So much so, in fact, that the senior official at the US consulate in Berlin, Raymond Geist, presciently told the State Department on December 6th, 1938, weeks before Hitler uttered even the threat, that, quote, "the Germans have embarked on a program of annihilation of the Jews," unquote. Thanks to Richard Breitman's excellent biography of Geist, entitled The Berlin Mission, which appeared late last year, we now know a great deal more about this long forgotten but remarkable man and about why he drew this fateful conclusion. In 1930s Berlin, Geist adroitly led parallel double lives. On the personal side, he eluded notice as a gay man romantically involved with a German national while living in a violently homophobic state. In his professional role, he sought to help Jews escape Germany, but was, as Brightman puts it, fundamentally a hawk, but tactically a dove. That is, determined to help as many people as he could, but without provoking a crisis in German-American relations. Beginning in early 1937, Geist's duties brought him into regular contact with two high-ranking Gestapo officials, Werner Best and Karl Haselbacher, whom he cultivated. These were the men who informed Geist in mid-November 1938 that Nazi policy had reached a turning point. According to Geist's report to Hugh Wilson, the American ambassador whom President Roosevelt had recalled to Washington for consultations after the pogrom, the leading Nazis, and this is a quote from Geist's message to Wilson, are intending, I hear from my friend Dr. Best, to bring the Jewish situation to a close as rapidly as possible. They are intending to impose all the restrictions and hardships possible so that Jews will be returned to the ghetto and inevitably perish. The Germans are determined to solve the Jewish problem without the assistance of other countries, and that means eventual annihilation. Geist's prediction came true more slowly than he expected, in part for an ironic reason. In the short run, Kristallnacht was a success from the Nazi regime's point of view. Briefly but perceptibly, the rampage pried open the doors of admission to the United Kingdom and the United States, shocking public and official opinion enough to allow about 100,000 Jews to gain access to both places before the gates narrowed again during the summer of 1939. But this was as nothing when set against the German conquest of Poland shortly thereafter. Its German annexed or occupied portions contained 2 million Jews. In pursuit of a Jew-free Greater Germany, the Reich clearly was chasing its own tail. Thus, official Nazi policy toward Jews in 1940 combined measures that accelerated their attrition, such as the relocation of most German Jews to so-called Jew houses and the formation of ghettos in Poland, and simultaneously prepared the way for the forcible deportation of all Jews under German control to a succession of imagined destinations, at first Madagascar, later the outer reaches of a conquered Soviet Union, beyond the Ural Mountains and above the Arctic Circle. But as each of these so-called reservations proved unachievable, all of the conditions posited by Weizsäcker, Das Schwarze Korps, and Hitler in 1938-39 came to pass. The numerous Jews remaining in the Nazi sphere could not be expelled. They had become impoverished, and the war had occurred. And so, during the latter half of 1941, the fulfillment of the prophecies of 1938 took place, albeit in 2 steps. First, the Nazi regime opted to bring death to the Jews in the path of its invasion of the Soviet Union, and thus to avoid the problems of managing ghettos that had arisen in Poland. The murders initially were to be carried out by special shooting units drawn from the SS and assorted police formations, concealed from the wider world under cover of war, and justified to German witnesses as preventing sabotage and forestalling partisans, in short, as acts of self-defense. Second, just as these killing operations in the East expanded to encompass women and children as well as men. Hermann Göring directed Reinhard Heydrich of the SS to find, quote, an overall solution to the Jewish question in the entire German sphere, unquote. Heydrich and his subordinates quickly realized that they had the capacity to bring the Jews already in Germany's grasp to death by much less conspicuous and labor-intensive ways of killing than those practiced in the conquered portions of the USSR. By deporting Europe's remaining Jews to remote sites, applying the gassing methods developed during the so-called euthanasia action of 1940 to 41 against handicapped people in Germany, exploiting the cheapness and lethality of a fumigant already in use at many camps and military sites, the infamous Zyklon, and burning the bodies. The SS could achieve its dream of a Jew-free Reich in relatively short order. Consequently, the effects of Zyklon were tested on Soviet prisoners of war at Auschwitz in September 1941. Construction of a gassing installation at Belzec began in November, and a broken down manor house began functioning as a killing installation at Chelmno on December 8th. The stage was literally set for the carnage that followed between March 1942 and February 1943, when fully half the victims of the Holocaust perished in only 11 months, mostly at makeshift installations. Kristallnacht not only prompted German policymakers to predict the murderous future, but also revealed the availability of personnel to act it out. For though the perpetrators of the pogrom in November 1938 consisted primarily of Nazi Party stalwarts, mostly SI men, stormtroopers, acting under orders, the assaults on the Jews and their possessions frequently were cheered on and intensified around the country by male teenagers imbued with the bloodlust in which the regime had schooled the German people. This is one who had plundered a synagogue. The willingness of these young men to plunder and attack their neighbors in 1938 foreshadowed their readiness 3 to 5 years later, now in the uniforms of the police, the army, and the SS, to torture and murder Jews in the occupied East. And here you see it was a public spectacle for those now 20-year-old teenagers. All in all, then, the pogrom of November 1938 gave rise to the thought of wholesale slaughter, though not yet the reality, and it rehearsed German youth in viciousness. In the history of the Holocaust, the pogrom thus announced the end of the beginning and the beginning of the end. Thank you all very much for your attention. I'll be happy to answer what questions that have come in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayes. That was very, very powerful and very, very timely with all the things that are going on in our country right now. We wanted to open the floor for Q&A. I noticed that a few participants had raised their hands. If you would please enter your questions in the Q&A, that would be wonderful. We had already received one question, and I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Peter Stein, a City College and Princeton alum, the former director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center at William Patterson, and himself a survivor from the former Czechoslovakia. And he writes, most of the destruction of Kristallnacht focuses on Germany and Austria, but his relatives, including an uncle, aunt, and cousin, had fled to Teplice in 1938 in Prague for safety. The family had been in the textile business, but ran for their lives. Tragically, all were sent to Dresden, and in the fall of 1942 to Auschwitz, where they were murdered. Could you please address the conditions in the Sudetenland before the German invasion and after Kristallnacht?
The Sudetenland had been an area of it's the border. This is the border region of Czechoslovakia that on the west side that is highly mountainous and adjoins Saxony and Bavaria. And it had largely been inhabited. The predominant part of the population was German speaking, even though it was part of Czechoslovakia. The Munich conference, which gave this territory to Germany, occurred about 5 weeks before Kristallnacht, and the Germans came in to the area during the month of October. Most of the Jews who were living in the Sudetenland knew of the hostility that the Nazi regime would bring to them, and they knew it not only because of what had happened in Germany, but because of what the German-speaking population's version in the region of a Nazi party had already done to them. And so most German Jews, particularly property owners, fled the Sudetenland very fast to get back to the rump of the Czech Republic where they would be safe. And they were for 5 months. And in March of 1939, the rump of the Czech Republic was occupied by the Germans, and that's what led to first the deportation of Czech Jews to Terezin, and then later the deportation of elderly German Jews to that particular place. Things happened so abruptly in the Sudetenland because Jews who lived there knew what was coming.
Peter, we have another question, and I'm actually going to link it to a third question. And it is, why did the Nazis mostly remove men first? And the tied-in question to that, asked by another attendee, is why were the Kristallnacht Jewish arrests limited primarily to men with a few women?
Well, the assumption of gender roles in those days was that, women stayed home and took care of the house, and men were in control of the property. And the arrests were primarily designed in order to force men to sign over their assets to the Nazi regime. So the Nazis saw no particular purpose in arresting the women or the children, but you took the breadwinner to a camp, and you treated that person badly and you shook him down. So that was the strategy there. Now, in the Soviet Union, the shootings began with men because the shootings were justified as preventing the possibility of guerrilla resistance to the German occupation. And it was not thought that women or children would carry out the German resistance. At first, it was not thought. It was thought that men who had been militarily trained would be the source of the threat. So you kill them immediately. But once they did that, they realized roughly 8 weeks into the invasion that the women and children were in many cases left destitute, and they had to be somehow either fed or somehow looked out for, and the Nazi regime didn't want to do that. So they decided to extend the killing so that it would include everybody. And then they said, the women have to be killed, and even the children have to be killed, because they can be the eyes and the ears of snipers. They could be helpers of resistance. And so this became their rationale.
Okay, so Peter, I really, really love the lucid kind of novel way that you walked us through from 1933 all the way to 1938. And I think that what's really been interesting about looking at Kristallnacht and me teaching it in my classes and talking about this idea of permissibility, which I think is that turning point that I think you talk about. And so I'm kind of looking at a question that is asking this a question about perhaps what's going on in our political situation. But I really want to turn that around a little bit and talk about this notion of permissibility. What does that mean in your work in terms of looking at the Holocaust, in retrospectively, but also going through these movements that you did so well?
One of the striking things about Germany in the 1930s is the way in which what is respectable and permissible and what is not changes. And it changes because power changes hands. Power magnifies the ideas of the people who hold it. And before 1933 in Germany, there was plenty of anti-Semitism. but it was not quite respectable, and it certainly was not backed by the power of the state. After 1933, that was the default position, to be an anti-Semite. That was the thing that got you ahead in the world, because the Nazis monopolized the public discourse and monopolized the means of advancement. So people adapted to it. They decided that they would echo it because they could use that for their self-interest and so on. And it was also impermissible to defend Jews. If you stood up for them, you would be also potentially beaten up or arrested. There's a German who went into exile in 1938 named Sebastian Haffner, who became a very successful journalist. And he wrote his memoirs about these early years before he left the country. And he tells stories about, for instance, walking with his girlfriend down a main street in the middle of Berlin, and a group of stormtroopers come by, and they're marching and singing and so forth. And the people on the sidewalks, if they did not raise their hand in the Nazi salute, some of the stormtroopers would step out and hit them. And you would never get arrested for doing that. That was state-sanctioned violence. So the environment in which Germans were steadily desensitized to the pain they were inflicting, and steadily told they were reinforced in inflicting that pain. That was what happened between 1933 and 1938. And then, as I said, from the example of those teenagers, it clearly did happen because they felt free to behave like this in 1938.
So, I mean, connected to that is the question that we have, and the question and answer, which asks the question about our own political situation, the permissibility of racism that we've seen, what's been going on in our country, not just in our country, but as you know, in Europe and other places, including places like where I was born, in Pakistan, in Turkey. It's kind of this wave. So how do, I guess the person who's asking the question is, what can we do? How can we stop this kind of wave that's going on? What are the tools that you can give us from your, scholarship?
Well, the tools are on two levels, the political and the personal. What you do on a collective basis politically is you fight against that, and you join groups and organizations and other people who are opposed to the dehumanization of any category of people, who are opposed to what was the essential Nazi tactic, which is to divide the world between us and them. And then to say that everything that serves us is good, and everything that weakens them is also good, and all's fair in war. And so what you do is you reduce all politics, all human interaction to stark binary choices, and you then dehumanize the opponent as an evil person. So we have to collectively join groups and organizations that resist that condemn that. The personal is harder in a certain sense because it requires individual courage. You have to be willing to speak up alone sometimes when you are involved, when you encounter that sort of thing, these attitudes or this tendency to dehumanize categories, and you have to simply say, hey, that's not okay. That requires individual courage. It's very uncomfortable sometimes, but we all have that responsibility. You cannot let this way of categorizing human beings go unchallenged.
Thank you. We have one more question, and that's related to also what's going on in our society now versus then. You talked a little bit about permissibility and things becoming acceptable, especially in public discourse. And when we look at youth now and the role of Hitler Youth and the role of violence and misinformation and propaganda, I'm wondering what lessons can we draw now when there's a generation of young people who don't have this history, and this is how they're growing up, and all of the discourse that's happening around us is normal.
Well, we have a special problem that didn't exist in the 1930s, which is social media and the way in which things are spread without any adequate fact-checking system. When Mark Zuckerberg started out, he said he was going to bring about the democratization of knowledge. What he's brought about is the debasement of knowledge. because there's no fact checking on the internet. There's no way of saying what kind of information is better than other kinds. And what was a trick of the Nazis, that regardless of them not having the internet, is first what they did is they established by definition that their opponents were lying. Goebbels' favorite, the propaganda minister, his favorite phrase as the Nazis were rising to power is die Lügenpresse, the lying press, which functions somewhat nowadays as an equivalent to nowadays the lamestream media, that kind of thing. And this is a way of distorting people's information fields, which is the first step to getting them locked into a one-side us versus them mentality. We face it all the time, and we all have to learn how to, number one, evaluate the information that comes to us, sort it out, see whether it is inspired by animus or by really an attempt to explain and know something. No citizen is free of these challenges. You have to be doing this in your life all the time. So I think that, I would also say to everybody on this, my first step would be I'd get off of Facebook, but I never got onto Facebook. And I never did, because the first time I heard the idea, I said, this is the worst idea I've ever heard. What an enormous time suck. So I've never gone near social media, but I do recommend to anybody to slow down, get off of it, take in your information from reputable sources, mostly things that you can read, so that you're going slowly enough to decide whether it's believable or not. Don't take in your information from network news, which is trying to agitate you most of the time. That's its principle. It's also like social media. The idea is to glue your eyeballs to the screen. And the best way of doing that is agitating you. Don't fall for it.
Thank you.
I think we have a few more questions, right? Maybe you want to take the one in the chat?
Dr. Hayes, you answered part of this question, but one of our questioners asks that the Kristallnacht you described as a rehearsal meant to prepare Nazi youth for viciousness. Could you talk a little bit more about the other steps taken to prepare the rest of the regime to create that same permissiveness that in the question that you answered for Manaz, that creates this environment of impunity, this ability to treat someone as a non-human or less than human?
Well, the central postulate of Nazi ideology is these people are out to get us, and they have been getting us for at least 100 years. So this was the first thing that Nazis kept saying: the Jews are our mortal enemies, and we're not really victimizing them. We're just defending ourselves. This was the line of the ideology. So they grew rich in our country by profiteering off of us. We're going to take all that money back. They are the forces behind our international enemies, especially they are the forces behind communism. And therefore, we have to strike against them before they can inflict those terrible things like the Bolshevik Revolution on us. So this is a kind of upside down worldview in which the Nazis postulate that these people are a mortal threat to us. And since they're a mortal threat, the smartest thing we can do is nip them in the bud, if you will, cut off the head of the snake. And so that's the central teaching. And this was drummed into Germans, because remember, there are no international newspapers even sold within the country. At train stations, that was forbidden. There are no international media that are getting across the borders and so forth. So there's a relentless propaganda machine always telling Germans the same thing over and over. And at the same time that this is happening, the day-to-day life of Germans in the 1930s is generally improving. The Nazi regime carried out the fastest recovery from the Depression of any country in the world. They did it by throwing enormous amounts of government money into the economy. most of it for rearmament purposes. But they did generate a recovery. Everybody went back to work. The standard didn't necessarily rise, but you had a little more security. And so Germans were hearing these two things simultaneously. One, the Jews are our enemy, the Jews are the threat, and so forth. And two, look what a bang-up job we're doing reviving this country. And the messages bleed into each other. And more Germans are willing to take the hostility with the prosperity. And thus, that's fine. So this is the way in which conformity and indeed even internalizing Nazi values occurs throughout German society. There's a very good historian of this era named Peter Fritsche, who has written a book called Life and Death in the Third Reich. And what he tries to trace is how Germans became Nazis, how they came to believe, because after all, when Hitler came to power, 55% of the Germans had never voted for him. I like to illustrate this story with an example from other work that I've done. I write books about corporations in Nazi Germany and their conduct. And I've written two books, one each about a chemical company, one called IG Farben, which was a giant chemical company, one called Degussa, which was a niche producer, mostly in precious metals and so forth. The thing that unites them is that in 1933, these two companies had, I quickly do the math in my head, I think it was 44 members of their boards of directors. Not a single one was a member of the Nazi Party in 1933, when Hitler came to power. Flash forward 10 years, 1943. They are using slave laborers. They factory concentration camp inmates as their laborers. They have both participated in taking over the property of Jews in Germany and in occupied countries up until that time. They are both major producers for the German war effort. And then here's the final thing. They are the partners. The two firms are partners in the company that makes Zyklon, and they sell it to the SS. Now, how do you get from 1933, these companies have no members of the boards of directors who are Nazis, and in 1943, these companies behave as if they are fully agreed, paid up members of the Nazi Party and all of its ideology? And what happens is, of course, this transformation of Germany into a murderous society. It's a transformation that occurs in part because of the economic and foreign policy successes of the Nazi regime, in part because of the propaganda, in part because many people gain from the persecution of the Jews. They get their jobs, they get their property, and all of these things. And then also this intoxication that grips the Germans after the humiliations of defeat in World War I and the Depression and so forth. In the 1930s, they looked at each other and they said, "Wir sind wieder wer." We're somebody again. And this is the way that society sort of comes together in a willingness to kill.
One of the daughter of one of our advisory board members has asked the question, why, in your view, has Kristallnacht come to be called the start of the Holocaust, when, as you've said, it was actually the beginning of the end and the end of the beginning?
Yeah, I think the start of the Holocaust is the moment that Adolf Hitler came to power. I don't think that you can date it any later than that. What does develop, as I said at the beginning, is that the Nazis have a single objective: removing the Jews from Germany, from its territory, and from its intellectual and cultural life. And they discover what they can do in the early 1930s. They discover that they can persecute the Jews without anybody getting in their way. They can do these things because Germans don't stand up for the Jews and foreign powers don't stand up for the Jews. But then they discover, and this is why I made the point about the vocabulary in 1938, then they discover what they can't do. They can't push them out of the country. They keep expanding faster than they are getting people to go away, and other countries won't take them. And then this third step, they can't do emigration, they can't do expulsion, they realize in 1941 that they can do extermination. And they can do it, which I didn't say in the talk, but it is important to understand, they can do it cheaply. The Holocaust does not cost much. I have worked out how much Zyklon was used to gas people at Auschwitz and Majdanek. I know how much the SS paid for that, and how many people were killed by it. And when you put those numbers together, you find out that in 1942, the cost of gassing someone was 1 US cent per corpse. So this was not difficult. The only one of the installations where the buildings were even made of stone is Birkenau. Chelmno, people are killed by marching them through the basement of an old ruined manor house. They get up on the other side and they walk into the back of vans where the exhaust tubes are hooked up to the back. The vans drive off into the forest. Everybody in the van dies. That costs only gasoline. At Sobibor and Treblinka and Belzec, the carbon monoxide is generated from captured Soviet tank engines. The only cost is gasoline. All the buildings are made out of wood. The first gas chamber, well, there are 2 rounds of gas chambers at each of these places, but the first round wasn't even made out of bricks. And then later they're replaced with brick walls. But it's incredibly cheap to create installations at which tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are killed. So they discover that they can do this. They've run out of options and they decide, why not? It's during war. We can conceal what's happening in the East. And then in Western Europe, where people might see if we did the same things, we'll just take the people and take them out to the East and kill them. And so this is how they learn. But their goal is consistent all the time. They want to remove the Jews from German life because they claim the Jews are their mortal enemies and threats. And once you give yourself over to this kind of a paranoid belief, then there's no limit to it. There's no way of talking people out of that.
Peter, we actually have a question about events that occurred in other countries around the time of Kristallnacht. So there were also responses in Paris that some of our audience has raised. One indicated that around the time of Kristallnacht, her father was arrested, interrogated in Paris, and given 24 hours to leave and return to Poland. And that, if you could explain how that was linked to the, perhaps to the Greenspan, the assassination of the German emissary.
In the French government at this time, roughly parallel to Kristallnacht, that is the fall of 1938, that is the high point in pre-war France of the appeasement policy. The foreign minister at the time, I think it was Bonnet, was himself an anti-Semite and was deeply determined not to offend the Germans. In fact, a month after, 3 weeks, I think, after Kristallnacht, France and Germany signed a new treaty of amity and cooperation and so on. So the willingness, there were a great many people in France who blamed the Jews for what was happening to them in Germany and blamed them for disrupting German-French relations, which is, when we look back on that, we think this too is an upside down way of understanding the world. But so that's why there might have been this kind of action against an individual who was not a French. Remember, Greenspan was in France because he was illegally there, living with his uncle and aunt. And after he shot Ernst von Rath and was arrested, the uncle and the aunt were prosecuted for having harbored him because he didn't have a visa. So this was the environment in France at the time. Preserving good relations with the Germans is more important than what's happening to the Jews.
Okay, I have one last question and we'll close. So, you talked a lot about propaganda and internalized propaganda, not allowing international news in, and sort of the default was the anti-Semite. You just became that, and it was not something that was spoken about until the permissibility of it, right? The actions against Jews. So the question is really about the populist movement today, and also Trump supporters, and how we look at that propaganda and how that's internalized in terms of many of the populist movements that I even mentioned before. Could you make a remark about the propaganda today, or how you see that in comparison or very differently?
Well, I could say a lot of things about this, and I want to be fair to people who sympathize with Donald Trump. They have lots of different reasons. They're not all alike. I don't want to lump them all together and so forth. But ever since Trump was elected, I have said, because right in 2016, there were lots of people asking, do you hear the footsteps of 1933? Do you and so on? And I said, no, I think Donald Trump is as American as apple pie. We have been through this before. We've had these phases in our history: McCarthyism, the Red Scare after World War I, anti-immigrant feeling in the 1880s, which was predominantly directed at Catholics, anti-immigrant feeling in the 1840s, which was also predominantly directed at Catholics. We've had these things before. What does alarm me as a parallel is the mentality of some of the followers who really do have an us against them notion, who really do have a sense that there are some people who are more American than others, which is, of course, you don't have to know much about American history to know what a fallacy that is. And because what this country is in any decade is a different population mix from the decade before. And that's the way in which we have evolved and succeeded. But so I do see things that are said in the name of antiquated ideas that trouble me and worry me. It's very hard to check these because they're not, no one can rationally believe that we are the master race, which Nazism taught. No one can rationally believe that. And I look at the headline today about the possibility of a vaccine. The inventors of that vaccine are German Turks who live in Mainz. They are the people who founded the company that is the partner to Pfizer that has produced this. Now, isn't that the most wonderful argument against master race thinking that has occurred recently? These are people who are immigrants to Germany, who have just done an enormous service, not only to that country, but to the world. So, you can't rationally believe in these things, and therefore it's very hard to talk people who do believe in them out of them. But we all have to guard against this. We all have to constantly be saying that we have to take each other as we are and live with each other.
On that note, that's a wonderful note to end on. I just really want to thank you, Dr. Hayes and Dr. Cohen and Dr. Fry. This is a wonderful partnership. And I want to say that, time can be uncertain, but I think your, very good point about social media and news and knowledge, and know your research and know what you're saying and be aware and be educated. And that is what we are all about here. All of us partners, we're all about education. We care about our students. We care about our future. We care about our communities. And that's what we can do for each other. So I really thank you so much, Peter, and I hope we'll be in touch again.
Glad to help.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yay. Let's hear the applause. We should have some applause in the back.
Okay.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Be well.
Bye-bye.